Greetings, fellow barbarians. It is I, Alan Odinson, and this is the Barbarian Lounge podcast. I want to thank you guys and gals for joining me today. Got an awesome show lined up. I told you guys that I was working hard to get the software fixed so we could have some interviews, and damn it, I said I was going to do it, and damn it, it has been done. And I've got a great show lined up for you. We've got a really phenomenal guest. I've got several guests who are going to be coming on in the upcoming weeks, so stay tuned for those. But let's get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way to start with. I want to make this short, sweet, nice and fast in a hurry. So our website is thebarbarianlounge.com. Go there and check it out. You guys, if you've been listening to the show, you know there's a lot of articles. We've got a store on there where you can get some of our custom-made Thuggy cords that help support the show. Another great way to support the show is by clicking on that donate button. When you click on that donate button, you'll see two options. One is a one-time PayPal donation. The other option is our member site. That is our Patreon site. When you click on that, it will take you to our Patreon site where you can decide, you can basically support the show on a per-show basis. And you can do the minimum amount, which is $1, and that comes up to $8 per show. As you know, if you've been listening, we do 4 regular shows each month, but we also do 4 exclusive shows only available to Patreon members. So if you are a member, you get a total of 8 shows. It'll end up costing you $8 a month. Support the show. Get a little bit of skin in the game. Support your local podcaster. There's a lot of people out there in the fight right now. They are the people who are taking the time to speak to you. They are the people that are on the front lines in the fight. They're down in the mud. They're covered with shrapnel. They are the ones that are out there doing the fighting, and they need your support. They cannot go on continuing the fight without your support. So it is vital for you to support your local podcast host. Support the Barbarian Lounge right there. Become a member. Patreon.com/The Barbarian Lounge. Other things you can do to help support the show: support our sponsors. Odinson Archery, traditional bows made from non-traditional materials. There's a lot of different options on there right now through the end of, depending on when you're listening to this, November the 27th through December the 2nd. We're having the Rule the Yule sale. Massive sale on there. Plus, we're bringing back one of our specialty bows, the Valkyrie model. So you can go there and check it out. Check out OdinsonArchery.com. You can also find Odinson Archery on Facebook to get all of your archery needs, to give the gift of archery this year for Christmas. Forget all these silly gadgets and your fidget spinners and whatever the kids are playing with these days. Toss that stuff aside. It is time to start embracing the traditional aspects of our lives right now. We are becoming too connected to the system. There's no better way to do it, to start disconnecting your kids from this hybrid Borg monster that's wanting to constantly suck them in and wanting their attention. Give them the ability to learn something new, learn a new craft, learn something that will actually help them grow. Embrace the art of archery. Check it out, OdinsonArchery.com. Our other sponsor, Mitacon, MitaconsUSA.com. I'm going to do my commercial voice here. Mitacon, with a proper diet, supports the cell's fastest, most effective absorption of natural nutrients in each 250 milliliter bottle and sustains the body's mitochondrial generation of usable energy, key to producing ATP, the energy-rich fuel the body needs to achieve peak athletic strength, performance, endurance, and recovery. MitaconsUSA.com. Yes, check him out. My boy Ben will hook you up. When you go there, you tell him Alan Odinson sent you, and he will fix you up right now. I've been using Mitacon for a while. As you guys know, I use it for recovery and focus more than anything else. Recovery's been a big one for me. The muscles don't recoup as fast as they used to. What can I say? I'm getting a little old, a little gray here, a little hobble there, a little twinge in the back. So I need that little boost that Mitacon gives me. So check them out, MitaconsUSA.com. You can also find the Barbarian Lounge on Twitch, twitch.tv/Barbarian Lounge. If you don't know what Twitch is a game streaming service. And basically what we do is we go on there and we play different games and kind of do a live show as the game is going on. So go there, check it out. There's also a donate button there where you can say, hey, if you just like to, maybe you just like watching video games, that's cool. I figured it is a different platform to reach a different audience, and that is what we need to do. The young people are getting left behind, more so than most people wish to admit. And damn it, I'm going to reach out to them. Whether they listen or not, they're going to hear my nagging little voice in their headphones, and I urge you to join me. If you're there, you can do a live chat with me as the show's going on. So as I'm playing, I can see your chat, and we can talk, and you can ask me questions and all that good stuff. So it's pretty awesome. Twitch.tv/Barbarian Lounge. I believe that's about it, guys. I want to get right into this interview. That's why I pretty much did that in auctioneer voice there. So on this interview, I had a longtime friend, a guy who I've published several articles of his, with his permission, of course, on my website. I've known this gentleman for quite a while. He is I would say he's quite a humble guy, but really he is one of the, I would say one of the more credible names in the alternative media community. As you know, right now, the joke of mainstream media, as it slowly begins to decay and fall apart, there isn't much of a media anymore, a mainstream media that can be trusted. Even with groups like Fox News, a lot of people like to quote Fox News, but man, they've become pretty much CNN light anymore. So more and more, something I've known for a long time, more and more people are starting to move towards alternative media. And when we talk about this on the interview, while there is a lot of fuckery in the world of alternative media, there's also some hidden gems in there. And my buddy Brandon Turbeville, BrandonTurbeville.com, you'll be able to find all his information in the show notes. But BrandonTurbeville.com, you can check him out there. He used to do a show called Truth on the Tracks, which is on the UCY.TV network, which we can also find the Barbarian Lounge. He used to do a show on there. And I've been on his show a couple times talking about preparedness. And I mean, he's a very, very knowledgeable individual. And he's going to break down some stuff on this show that I believe is going to blow some people's minds and actually going to open some eyes to a lot of things, a lot of perceptions we may have to things that are going on overseas. He has done a lot of extensive work over in Syria and has been there multiple times. We talk about that a little bit. And, I think you guys are going to get a lot out of this. You're going to hear some, we're going to talk a little bit about conspiracy theories, because he's written, what kind of language is that? That's barbarian English for you right there. He has written several books on conspiracy theories, and he's very well versed in a lot of things, man. So if you've been looking for true alternative media and a true alternative media source, look no further. The Barbarian Lounge has got one of the best right now. So my friends, enjoy this interview with my good buddy Brandon Turbeville, and I will see you on the other side. All right, guys, I am on the line with a good friend of mine, Mr. Brandon Turbeville. Say hello to the lounge, Brandon.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's nice to have you on here. You guys, you've probably heard me talk about Brandon a little bit. You've probably heard me talk about Brandon and not know I'm talking about Brandon as well. He's a gentleman I've known for a while. A lot of you guys probably, if you've been kind of, I guess you can say, in the movement as I have for a while of all things that are not up to par in our government system, that you probably know who Brandon is, but a lot of my people probably don't. So, Brandon, why don't you give everybody just a quick rundown of who Brandon Turbeville is?
Sure. I've been covering, I guess you would call it political issues and another, I don't know what else you would call it other than politics, but following the, current events and trying to bring, a healthy, skeptical opinion and so forth to it. For about now 8-9 years, and the area where I tend to focus on the most is the Syrian crisis, which I started covering back in 2011 when it started happening, and have covered it all the way until today. I've written about 8 books now, and 2 of them have to do with Syria, and others are on different topics. But I feel like I'm pretty well versed in a lot of different areas, but particularly geopolitics in the Middle East. And I've been largely writing for activistpost.com for probably 8 of those 9 years. I've had articles posted in a lot of different websites and have done interviews with a lot of different organizations, including some mainstream ones, occasionally when maybe they forget who I am and try to They ask me to go on air on occasions, and then I remind them. But it's mainly been mostly alternative media writing for the last 8-9 years, and ended up going to Syria itself about a month ago, where I just came back from that trip and traveled all across the country. So I imagine we'll get into a little bit about that too. But that's pretty much what I do. I had a radio show for quite some time, which I just ended this year. And, people can check out BrandonTurbeville.com if they're interested in my work. That's where I repost all of my articles and all the interviews and the YouTube videos, etc. All that's there. So if they want to check out the books, if they want to check out the articles, it's all archived at BrandonTurbeville.com.
Yeah, it's funny, you've been in the world of alternative media for a while, and really anymore with mainstream media has almost become the joke that we always knew it was. I mean, this isn't nothing new to us. We knew mainstream media was a joke, but now it's really starting to kick off, and people are seeing the true investigative journalists. Real media is from that alternative source that a lot of people have been forsaking for so long.
And that's why they're trying to shut it down. That's why you see Facebook becoming draconian and trying to shut down alternative media. Twitter is now doing the same thing in different ways. Google itself changed a bunch of algorithms because the alternative media has grown by leaps and bounds just because, rational people aren't looking to CNN and Fox and MSNBC for their news anymore, and they shouldn't, because I go back to the trip I took to Syria and the stuff that I've been covering. What you're hearing on the mainstream media is 180 degrees different from what is actually happening on the ground there. I could point to several instances where the mainstream media hasn't just reported misinformation, but or even disinformation. Really, they've created and concocted literal fake news on TV sets just to push a propaganda narrative. And I think the more and more ridiculous their stories become, the more and more rational people start stepping away from them. And that's why the alternative media has grown to the level that it has in the last several years.
It's really great to see that finally starting to happen. I think we all kind of knew it would happen eventually, but regarding the Syria issue, I'm going to ask you in just a minute to give kind of a rundown of that for people who aren't really sure about exactly what's going on, because we do have kind of one side of the story. But I'm curious. I'm sure a lot of other people are curious as well. What was it about the Syrian conflict that kind of drew you towards it?
Well, I think, toward the tail end of what was happening in Libya, the situation in Syria started popping up on the news, and I think two things. I knew what was happening in Libya, and I remember distinctly I was going to give a lecture about 9/11, actually, and on the way, right before I left, I watched the murder of Gaddafi on CNN. And that's something I will never forget. And when I came back, I really started to delve deep into the Syrian crisis. And then, of course, was lucky enough to find some sources or connect with some sources who were telling me a much different story about what was happening there than what the mainstream media was telling us. And, that was in 2011. And 6 years later, here we are. I'm still doing the same thing. That was really the catalyst. I'm not sure if that was a clear-cut answer to your question, but that's really how I started paying attention to it. Because prior to that, I'd written about a lot of different subjects, anywhere from natural health to other things. But the end of the Libyan crisis, the murder of Gaddafi, and then connection I had with some sources in Syria or from Syria. Really were the catalyst to get me thinking about this deeply. And at the time, we thought it was going to be over in 6 months, just like Libya was. We thought that the Syrian government was going to fall, and that we were going to see jihadists raising their flag over the capital in Damascus. And again, 6 years later, here we are. That's not the case.
Right. And a lot of the people that I talk to, one of the things I always stress on this show people who are building communities, tribal communities, and whatnot, I tell them to be very wary of building their walls too high, to not pay attention to geopolitical stuff. And a lot of people, they're like, you know what? Syria's not here. We're not in Syria. Why should we even care about Syria? It doesn't matter. It's not here. It's not happening here in the United States. But what they don't understand is the things that happen there, the things that happen in Libya. You can look at the spread of ISIS. You can look at, the different falls of different governments all throughout that region. That whole destabilization process, all of that sends tremors through the ether, I guess you could say, sends tremors through the ether across the world. And whether we want to pay attention to it or not, those little teeny reverberations echo all the way here. It's like a small ripple in a pond, and it slowly starts traveling over here to the west.
Yeah, and it can have reverberations. I mean, never let anybody tell you that these things don't affect us on an individual level. I mean, we've seen situations. Last year, I sat in Beirut as the United States was bombing the Syrian military right, a mile away from where the Russian military was located. Right, we could have literally had World War III on our hands. That's not the most reassuring experience that you can have, by the way.
Yeah.
But not only just a war with a major power, but there are elements that are indeed coming right back here to the United States. And I'm not just talking about jihadists. I'm not talking about necessarily refugees, but either elements within American society that are going over to Syria and will be coming back and being battle hardened themselves. So it has an actual real effect on our daily lives too. And of course, there's a lot of other aspects that one could talk about in terms of curtailments and freedoms and stuff like that we've seen ever since 9/11. But yeah, these things are incredibly important in terms of the way the world aligns itself. We talk about, you can talk about imperialism and how it tends to come home once it's spread itself abroad, and that's, I think where we're at today, that our empire, it's not just the American empire, there are other powers involved, but has spread itself so far that it's going to be, the big eating machine is going to be coming home soon too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's one of the reasons I've always told people you've got to pay attention to these things. You don't have to go in deep. You don't have to, choose your rabbit hole carefully, but but it's still something that it matters. It matters in the big picture. So talking about Syria, let's give just kind of a brief overview of this situation. Basically, what is going on in Syria? How is the Syrian conflict that we hear so much about? Give everybody kind of a quick breakdown of that, if such a thing even exists. A quick breakdown.
Yeah, I'll try to do it simply, and then it can become complex if we want to make it that way. But basically, what happened in 2011, we saw the Arab Spring protests going across the Arab world in Egypt and Libya and Bahrain, where it got put down because they were working with the West. But what essentially this was not an organic movement against tyrannical governments. This was a movement that was funded by the United States in concert with British intelligence, French intelligence, basically NATO powers, and in concert with Saudi Arabia. And it was mainly orchestrated by networks like the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, the official CIA color revolution apparatus in tandem with the George Soros color revolution apparatus, which is pretty much the same thing tied at the hip. So they would go into these countries and they would orchestrate protest, and a lot of these countries, they had legitimate complaints. Of course, every country has legitimate complaints, some of them more than others. But these protests would take off, and then if they were unable to topple a government through massive protest and organization, then violence would soon happen. And then we saw that in Libya, where there were these massive so-called protests that were taking place, and then all of a sudden we had armed militias shooting at security personnel and killing civilians and so forth. And in Syria, we saw just that, right? Early on, these alleged protests were taking place. The mainstream media here all presented them as if they were, hippie protesters in the park, calling for, environmental fairness and, peace and love and stuff. But these guys were not hippie protesters. These were jihadists. There was an element of society that were out protesting because they were pushed by the Soros and USAID factions and so forth. But the majority were jihadist elements, right? That were funded by the same organizations, by the CIA, by Saudi Arabia, and it was violent from the word go. From the very day that these so-called protests were taking place, members of the protesters were shooting not only at police and security personnel, but they were shooting at men, women, children. It was just complete, just some of it, most of it was random. Directed Syrian forces were, obviously it was not random, but they would have snipers on the top of roofs, and they would shoot people on the way into the hospitals, people on the way into the schools. They would pop off little kids going to school. They would shoot doctors going into the hospital. They would shoot random people trying to go to work. They would set off bombs and so forth in the streets, and it was violent from the word go. The Syrian security forces were sent out to deal with the massive, again, so-called protests, and the Syrian government, at the order of the president, who's now demonized in Western media, he sent them out without guns because he didn't want a brutal crackdown on the people that were out protesting. Sent them out with clubs and so forth. Well, you can't send guys out with clubs to fight guys with AKs. And so what happened was the security forces and the police were, many of them were killed. And eventually, the Syrian military had to send armed police and security forces to deal with them. And when he did that, it was reported in the mainstream media that Assad is brutally cracking down on his people, killing his own people, and so forth. This was not what was happening. The Syrian security forces were shooting at armed terrorists, and the overwhelming majority of them were not even Syrian. They came from Libya, they came from Saudi Arabia, and they came from all across the world. These people were being heavily funded and armed by the United States, by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey, and assisted by Israel. And they were also assisted by French intelligence services. Some of the French intelligence agents were actually arrested by the Syrian security forces and turned back over to the French early on in the conflict. And then these things spread, right? These attacks spread. They went from Homs, they were in Damascus, they were Aleppo, all the major cities. Then they started taking place out in the countryside, armed groups, or nothing like protesters at all, even while the mainstream media were calling them peaceful protesters and so forth. These were not peaceful, and they were armed military groups of jihadists, right? These guys were running around beheading people, while the mainstream media here were calling them protesters and activists. In fact, if you go back to some of the earlier mainstream articles, and they still do this to this day, they'll quote, activists say that Assad's security forces killed 50 people in this area, right? Well, activists say can be translated to mean terrorists say, because there were no activists there. These activists were jihadists. And again, they were coming from all of these other countries. And the reason they had to come from all of these other countries is because there was not the jihadist element in Syria. This was something that was alien to Syria. Syria is a secular country, and the government's secular. They have all kinds of different religions in Syria, and there was not this jihadist element. There were, obviously some elements were there because there were a small portion of the society. But Syria is a secular society. And again, this was my experience when I went there, right? A lot of the times I'll hear people try to reduce the Middle East to make it simple and say, well, those people have been fighting over there for 1,000 years over religion. Well, it's not true. Syria has not fought. They were not fighting over religion. Sunnis got along with Shiites. Muslims got along with Christians. They all got along with Jews. Everybody got along with everybody in terms of religion, and they still do. This jihadist philosophy was completely imported, and so were the fighters. Now, moving on, what we discovered was that a lot of the terrorists were being funded and armed by Saudi Arabia and the United States, and directed by the United States and Saudi Arabia. A lot of them were being trained in Jordan, and this is the beginning of ISIS, by the way. A lot of the ISIS fighters were trained in Jordan and brought to Turkey, and from Turkey they were shipped across the border into Syria. And then, of course, we had the big push for American military intervention to fight ISIS that the United States created. And I should mention that all of these so-called groups that have different names, whether you call it ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, or Al-Sham, whatever you want to call it, Free Syrian Army, they're all the same thing, right? They can have different names, but it's just the change of the name. They're united by ideology. They're united by the fact that they're fighting against Assad, that they're controlled by outside powers like Saudi Arabia and the United States. And you ask the Syrian people, what's the difference between Al-Qaeda and the Free Syrian Army? And they'll look at you with frustration and say there is no difference. They're the exact same thing. And they change these names based on what is necessary for Western propaganda. Just give you a quick example. I don't know if you remember this video, but Abu Sakar, right? This was, or Sakir, not the famous smoothie guy in Damascus, but this guy was a terrorist by that name. He killed a Syrian soldier and then on camera cut his heart out and took a bite of it for the camera, right? This guy, he actually, because of the alternative media, this made the rounds all over the internet. He was a member of the Yarmouk Brigade, which is part of the Free Syrian Army, the so-called moderate rebels. Now, if that is a moderate rebel, I would hate to see what an extremist rebel would look like. The guys that beheaded the 12-year-old boy on camera again, this is so-called moderate rebels. In fact, Nur-ad-Din al-Zengi were the name of that group, and they were not only considered moderate rebels, but they were vetted. Remember when we had the extreme vetting process?
Yes.
Give them weapons. These were vetted moderate rebels, and we gave them weapons, and they beheaded a 12-year-old boy on camera. So there is no difference between these groups. Al-Qaeda was, everybody knows what Al-Qaeda is, but in Syria, it went by the name of Al-Nusra, or Jabhat al-Nusra. These groups merged a couple of years into the Syrian conflict, and they started calling themselves the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, the IEIL. That name shortly got changed to the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which is ISIL, and then we started calling it Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. So it's the same thing. ISIS is just the official merger of Al-Qaeda and Nusra. And, we could go on and on pointing out how al-Sham would get weapons, and then the next day they would give them to Al-Qaeda, or we would give money to different terrorist groups or rebel groups, and then the rebel groups would just give up, disappear, and leave all their weapons, and Al-Qaeda would take it, and then the next day they'd join Al-Qaeda. This is, the story of the Syrian crisis. There's no difference between these groups. There's not a moderate rebel inside Syria. There never has been. It's always been a proxy war to destroy the Syrian government for a number of reasons. One of them is because of the Qatari pipeline that was supposed to go through Syrian territory, but Assad nixed that in favor of an Iranian pipeline, which would give, obviously, Iran a heads up in the energy market. There was also the resistance toward the Western system, because the Assad government refused to have a central bank, right? They had a national bank, which means it was owned by the Syrian government, not a central bank like we have, which is owned by private bankers. So they're outside of the Western system. They ban GMOs, for instance, and they present an obstacle to Israel. And it's one of the major resistors toward the Israeli expansion and aggression and genocide of the Palestinians. So that was something else that's a part of it, is that they resisted the Israelis as well, and it stands also as one of the last outposts of the Russian influence, right? Because the Russians had allies in Syria, they also had allies in Iran, but we also have to look at groups like PNAC, and remember General Wesley Clark after 9/11 went to the Pentagon. This is on YouTube with him talking about it. He went to the Pentagon and visited a friend there shortly after 9/11, and he says that a guy comes up, tells him that they're going to invade Iraq. He said, Iraq? Why would we do that? He said, it's worse than that. They plan to invade 7 countries, right? He listed Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, and others. And these are the countries that are on the chopping block, right? They've already taken out Libya. They've already taken out Iraq. And we have Syria, which has been on the chopping block, and the next step after Syria is Iran, and the step after that is Russia, and that's been written about by Zbigniew Brzezinski. So those are some of the geopolitical reasons for our involvement, and that's sort of a broad overview, and I hope I didn't ramble or confuse things by pointing that out, but the last 6 years have basically been a proxy war against the Syrian government initiated by NATO and the Gulf Cooperation Council and Israel.
And it's interesting, too, because, talking about the of those countries. I remember seeing that report of the different countries that were listed. And I remember Iran was kind of standing alone as the last one left. And by essentially overthrowing Syria, you're pretty much able to cut off a massive energy source that they've got, because you were talking about the pipeline now that's running there that's heading to Iran now, right? So by being able to overthrow the Syrian government, essentially you could control that area, cut off the energy source, which is basically a nice way of laying siege upon Iran and going forth from there. So it's pretty interesting, and it's funny, a lot of people maybe listen to this and they keep thinking, they might be thinking to themselves, why in the world would the U.S. do this, and why would they want to start proxy wars here? Don't they remember what happened with Al Qaeda, with the issue with Russia before, back in Afghanistan, all those areas up in there? But if you look at the history of, and not just the United States government, governments in general, proxy wars are a thing that's been done for a long time. It's a lot easier to get other people to fight your war for you rather than having to try and get congressional approval in order to send our own troops there. If you listen to my interview, I'm sure a lot of you guys listen to my interview with Ed Calderon, where he's talking about the arms trade and basically the proxy wars that are going on in Mexico, where the U.S. government is doing the exact same thing. You can listen to that interview and listen to this one and change Syria for Mexico and go back and forth, and you're pretty much going to have the same thing happening there.
Yeah, and another thing too is that if you cut Syria out, the land route between Iran and Hezbollah is cut, and it makes it extremely difficult, or much more difficult, to supply Hezbollah than it would have been if Syria had still been there and been an ally of Iran. And that's something that Israel is extremely interested in, because there are very few things that actually scare the Israelis, but Hezbollah is one of them. And you can see that now with the resignation of the Lebanese president and so forth. This is really just a way to try to sow chaos and destabilization in Lebanon, because it appears that Israel is looking toward really trying to go in and cut out Hezbollah in the near future too. So that plays a part in it as well.
Well, I was looking at some of your articles on BrandonTurbeville.com. And I'll put that link in for the website in the show notes here for our listeners. But I was looking at some of the pictures you had coming back from Syria, and this whole idea, especially here in Western media, they push this whole idea of the oppressed Syrian people and how Assad's a dictator and this and that. But you've got pictures of people girls walking around in mini skirts, and it certainly isn't the beacon of freedom like Saudi Arabia, right? I mean, everybody's like, oh, they're allowed, women are allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia now, and yeah, right. They can drive after a certain amount of time. They still have to wear their beekeeper outfit. All those things are still mandatory in places like Saudi Arabia that the U.S. is willing to work with. But there in Syria, you've got multiple religions, as you said. You've got girls are walking around with a lot more freedom there than they certainly have in any of these other places that the U.S. supports.
Yeah, and what's funny about Saudi Arabia is the things you just mentioned. Those are considered reforms.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia is getting better. Like they can actually drive after all of these qualifications.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing was that, talking about Saudi Arabia, the funny thing was that the female robot they gave citizenship to a few weeks ago actually has more rights than a regular woman does.
Yes, I know. It's great. It's unfortunate though that so many people, when they hear the word Syria, the image they have in their mind is sand, women in veils, That's Saudi Arabia. It really is. But that is not Syria at all. And, I've had people make comments to me like, if I went to Syria, I'd have to be drunk all the time because I just couldn't handle it, But, I know you can't drink there. It's like, you can't drink there. There's liquor stores everywhere. There's bars everywhere. We drank, 7 nights out of the 10. Mm-hmm. And it's again, the idea that the Muslims there, for instance, are really strict and scary people. People should just go there and visit and have their minds changed, right? I said we drank 7 nights out of the 10, and a lot of those nights we were drinking with Sunni Muslims who were really getting trashed, and it's the people there are completely different than what is presented on the media. It's funny, but it's not. But there's a CNN reporter, and I really wish I could remember her name so I could shame her as much as possible. But she constantly whines and bemoans the Assad government as the worst thing in the world. And she does a report from inside Syria in government-held territory, and she looks like a normal woman. Right? She's talking, her hair's uncovered, just like she'd give a report if she were in New York City. Then she does a report from terrorist-held areas, and she's covered in this black robe. She looks like an executioner. She's got everything covered. You can see only part of her face. Lots of freedom there, huh?
Yeah.
But, this doesn't ring a bell to anybody. That what kind of freedom are you looking for if you go to one area and you can speak freely and dress freely, and you go to another area and you have to dress like the executioner or be executed, then exactly who would you consider the more rational party? But I spent 10 days in Syria. We went to the major cities and saw a lot of little towns in between, and in Damascus, for instance, you hear bombs at least every hour, right, from the Jobar area where the terrorists are. And I got to speak to a lot of Syrians who told me their experience about the terrorists. And they, not one single person that I talked to had anything but hatred for these so-called rebels. And every single person I talked to supported their government in the war. That doesn't mean that before the war that people didn't have complaints and legitimate complaints, but they certainly rallied behind their government, and they're 100% in support of it now. again, I don't know how much I should harp on the freedom of women there, but we talked to a lot of women who had lived under the terrorist control for a while, and we heard horror stories. Right? There was this. I wish I could remember the name of the town. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on so much, but where a woman was captured, and she was a Christian woman, I believe, and a girl, like 16, 17, I think, and she was captured, and the terrorists wanted to ransom her to get money. So they went to her family and told them that they wanted something like $2 million or $250,000 or something, something outrageous for a person in Syria to be able to raise. And they wanted the money, and the family, of course, couldn't raise it. They did everything they could, but they couldn't raise the money. So the terrorists brought her out in front of the family and cut her up into pieces in front of the family.
Wow.
And this is just one story out of many, many stories. And the Syrian military, these guys are the sons of Syrian people, right? These are actual Syrians, for instance. And you could talk to any Syrian and ask them about their military, and you'll get the most real form of patriotism that you can ever hope to see. I mean, it's not fake. It's not drilled into them by football and Hollywood. It's because they're experiencing it, and the Syrian military has proven itself. It's actually a pleasure to see that type of patriotism from people.
Right. Yeah. Well, having been over there in different Middle Eastern areas, you've been to Syria and other areas around there. Tell me what you think about the idea of the refugee program. I know right now there's a lot of shit right now going on with Trump, where they're asking him about, every time he tries to block entrance from these countries that are, full of jihadis, and he's trying to block off a lot of this stuff, and he's getting nothing but pushback. Having been in a lot of these areas, tell me what you think about the travel ban.
Here's where it gets a little more complicated. A lot of the people who are coming over as refugees are not Syrian. We saw that in the mainstream media. You would see Syrian refugees are flooding into Europe, and they would be black.
Yeah.
No, that's not Syrian refugees. Take a look at the Syrian people. They're brown and white. That's their colors. Most of them identify as white, actually. But a lot of these people were coming from Eritrea. They were coming from Algeria. They were coming from other places. And they would go into Turkey, for instance, and get fake IDs because it says Syrian. Or they would just flood into Europe, and because Europe has this open immigration policy where they just take everybody, because it's apparently it's never been a melting pot in the history of Europe except the last 15, 20 years. So, it's a melting pot now. So they take everybody and they just call them all Syrian refugees against all logic. And that's why they're having a massive crisis with sexual assault in a lot of these countries and stuff now, because they're taking people who are coming from vastly different cultures. Now, again, most of them are not Syrian. If it was just simply a refugee process for the average Syrian person, it wouldn't be that bad. The average Syrian people are awesome. I'd love to have them here, but a lot of these refugees are coming in, even some of the ones who were given Syrian papers and so forth, are a lot of them are indeed jihadists. And this is, I have Syrian sources who are telling me this, that a lot of the people who are coming out, like the Turkey's letting in so it can then ship into Europe, are jihadist people, and they're giving preference to them, which is why you see a lot of so-called refugees coming in who are young men, right? Mm-hmm. Whenever there's a crisis, especially of violence, it's always the women and children that you're supposed to get out first. But we don't really see that. We see lots of young men in their 20s. So Turkey has been really instrumental in bringing these people across the border and then shoving them into Europe. And there's been a couple of European countries who've put a stop to it. I think Hungary is trying to put a stop to it. But Turkey is giving preference to people who are more extreme in ideology to send them across the border. And then, we get sob stories. And the answer, of course, is never in the media. It's never to stop bombing them and stop, arming proxy terrorists. It's always to let refugees in. So, as far as the travel ban goes, I'm fine with it. I think it's idiotic that the travel ban is placed on Syria and Saudi Arabians can travel over here, or various other countries can travel over here without such extreme vetting. Syrians can't, but Saudis can. That makes absolutely no sense. But we can only accommodate so many people in the United States, and we've got tens of millions of people who are over here illegally anyway. So it's time to curb some of this immigration. That might be a little off topic, but basically what I'm trying to say is that the immigration issue has been vastly distorted in the mainstream media, and they try to paint you as some type of racist if you don't think that you should allow your country to just be overwhelmed by immigrants when the country can't handle it. So
right. Well, you get a lot of these times where it's a couple things. You have most of the people that they're trying to bring here, that they're trying to bring in from wherever it may be. Most of the people that they're trying to flood the U.S. with, their cultures are simply incompatible with Western society. They just aren't compatible. They do not click. You can't bring in people over here and tell them, look, you're now an American. You're an American, and we're going to give you this, give you that. But these people still are walking around doing the exact same things that they were doing in their country, which, according to them was so bad they had to leave, but yet they're still bringing their same culture here with them and doing the same things and trying to push, setting up their own communities where, then you wonder why you start having these crazy terrorist attacks and guys driving cars through crowds of people. I mean, the immigration policy, if anything, the immigration policy that we've seen in Europe should be a massive warning to the people of the United States.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I want everybody to hear me clearly now. In terms of the average Syrian person, if we were set up where we could have more immigration and we weren't overloaded as we are, Syria would be a perfect place for people to come from, because the culture is, it's obviously it's a different country, different part of the world, so it's a little bit different, but the culture is compatible with us. Mm-hmm. But the people who are being sent over here by powers like Turkey, who are allowing refugees to come in, they're giving precedence to people who are indeed fanatics. And they're calling them Syrian, or some of them may actually be Syrian, but they're lumping them in with other groups of people who are not Syrian, and they're pushing them through Europe and then trying to put them in to the United States. And you can even talk to the Syrian people who will tell you, we don't want to go to the United States. We want the United States to go home and let us stay here. The people that are coming from places like Eritrea and Algeria and stuff like this, they're economic migrants. They're just looking for work and for higher living standards. And Europe, for instance, has been advertising for years the best welfare state in the world. So I don't even blame them for going there. They're being advertised as the best welfare state in the world. Why wouldn't you go?
Yeah, exactly. You're talking about, we've been talking a good bit so far about extremists and color revolutions and everything, and I think you can't really talk about color revolutions, violence, and violence from the word go. We've heard that a lot, comparing what's going on over there, and I don't think we can really talk about that without looking at the gigantic elephant in the room here in the United States and in other places, and that is cultural Marxism. When you listen to when you listen to this interview, as I was talking about earlier with Mexico, taking Mexico and changing it to Syria, and the way these color revolutions play out, if you take all of the things that we've heard that were happening, you can look at those happening right here in this nation as well with the rise of cultural Marxism. The left, we constantly kept hearing. Remember what he said when these so-called peaceful protesters in Syria were out there immediately getting violent, and they had to start sending in the armed police to try and bring them down and everything. This is exactly the same stuff we see here from the left. The same thing. There's no dialogue to be had. There's no conversations to be had. Immediately from the get-go, they're violent right off the line. And in the same thing, we see the same response from the media here. The media's like, peaceful protesters attacked, while they're the ones throwing soda cans filled with concrete and things like that. So, and people can find it on the barbarianlounge.com. I reposted one of your articles of these cultural Marxist groups actually over in Syria training. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this might actually seem like a surprise to a lot of people, but the article I think was entitled "LGBT Brigades in Syria." This I think was how it was presented in the mainstream, because they're supposedly fighting ISIS, right? And this, again, I don't want to make this too complicated, but the Kurds in Syria are obviously looking for their own state. There's Kurds in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, and they want their own state based on their ethnicity. And it's funny that a lot of anarchists, for instance, will support the Kurdish push to create a state on the basis that it is anti-state, anti-Syrian government or Turkish or whatever, but they want to create a state. Leftists will support them, even though creating a state based on your race is the definition of racism, right? They want to create that the Kurds have gone through Arab neighborhoods, Arab towns, burned it to the ground, killed people, killed Assyrians, killed Christians. This ethnic cleansing, just to create the Kurdish state that they want to see. And the Kurds are. Let me back up. Kurds and Kurdish fighting groups are two different things, right? So the Kurds in Syria are just like everybody else. They're fully Syrian. They're Kurds, but they're normal people. If you ask them, "What are you?" they will say Syrian. They won't say Kurdish. They'll say Syrian. Then, if you ask them, maybe they'll tell you their religion, and they'll tell you Kurdish. Completely assimilated in the Syrian culture. Fighting brigades like YPG and the PYD, that's the political wing of YPG, these groups are not assimilated. These groups are radical fanatics, and some of them can be Islamic fanatics, but most of them are cultural Marxists. And if anybody wants to get an idea of brainwashing, they can go watch some of these PKK or YPG brainwashing sessions. It's really a bizarre form of cultural Marxism, and it's based on feminism, and these guys will get into the brigades, and then they'll have these morning meetings where they sit around and read these communist pamphlets, and they talk about the benefits of feminism and how basically the patriarchy is the worst thing in the world. Then they go off to slaughter other people for an independent anarcho-leftist state. So they are being armed by the United States, and they have very close ties with the Israelis, particularly the Kurds in Iraq have ties with the Israelis. The YPG is fighting ISIS sometimes. They fight civilians sometimes. They fight Syrian military sometimes. And they've created this big swath of territory in the north part of Syria that they want to claim for their own. Now, what's happening is that groups from the United States who are also cultural Marxists are now going over to Syria and joining the YPG. And these are groups like members of Antifa and stuff like that. They're going over and joining the YPG, and what they're doing is learning how to fight. Right? I think I see a lot of people on the right always making fun of the Antifa activists and so forth, and making fun of them being skinny kids with glasses and they couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag. Well, these can. These guys are going to Syria, and they are learning how to shoot a gun, and they're learning how to kill people, and they're learning how to fight. And when they're done, they will be coming back to the United States. And make no mistake, we will let them back in. So when they come back, they're going to have the opportunity to teach other people what they've learned. And then, personally, I would suggest that maybe the people that were underestimated may have been able to sort of even the odds a bit. And there's a big article that was done, I think, God, was it Salon? I don't remember which magazine did this big piece on some of the guys and girls who were going. Rolling Stone, I believe, was the one that did it, of this profile of fighters that were coming from the U.S. and Germany and other places, particularly in the United States and Europe, where you can read about the background of some of these characters that go over there to fight these wars. And again, they're coming back. You can even see some of the pictures where you have the Kurds and the Antifa people holding each other's signs, right? You see some of the Kurds holding Antifa signs and vice versa. So it's something that people should really pay attention to. These, it's international communism for a reason, and I think people should look into it more closely, right? These people are getting, military training in the real sense of the word here. And the Kurds are no heroes. I continually hear in the mainstream now that the Kurds are supposedly the biggest force against ISIS or something like that. And these guys, I really want people to go to YouTube and look at the Kurdish cultural Marxist technique and how they willingly brainwash themselves every morning before they go off to fight. They continually show pictures of these beautiful Kurdish women who are in the Kurdish Women's Brigade, and that's all propaganda, of course. I mean, they do have a women's brigade, and a lot of them are beautiful, but they intentionally show specific women as an advertisement for their cause. Syrian military has women, and Christian militias have women, and the National Defense Forces, Syrian Defense Forces, and so forth have women in them as well. But that never gets talked about on the mainstream.
Right. Yeah. It's crazy because you're talking about them getting the training over there. That's one of the things I've been warning about for a long time now. I've never, it's all cute and fun to talk about these Antifa and the cultural Marxists and stuff like that. It's all fun and games to say, these skinny guys living in their mama's basement and everything. But I've always contended that it is very, very important to never, ever underestimate your opponent. Being underestimated is an advantage because people don't see you as a threat, and it allows you to sneak in there with an actual threat when the time is ready. And with the forming of a lot of these left-wing militia groups who are, by the way, violent in their nature. When you look back throughout history, everybody wants to look at the right wing as being the violent guys, and they'll point to OKC and everything, and I've talked about that at length on here, some of the strange things with that, but they conveniently forget all of the leftist terrorist attacks with the Weather Underground and a lot of these other groups out there. And if you've got Western cultural Marxist groups that are training with Kurds, if you have these people, do you not think that these people aren't going to link up even here in the United States? So now they've got, you could see an alliance between two great threats of Western culture.
Yeah, and the other thing about it is too, sometimes it's not even fully about training. It's just whether or not you have the balls to do